What's going on, guys? It's Cimo. So today I'm bringing to you a meta-analysis for the June 2018 format. I'm really excited to bring you this meta-analysis because this is realistically the largest event we're going to have before we get into the World Championship qualifiers. There's going to be a few other events scattered around here and there, but this is basically the best glimpse we're going to look at as to how the format's shaping up and what we can expect moving into this format. But before we get into that, if you guys haven't already, be sure to subscribe to the channel and hit that notification bell so you guys don't miss a single upload. But without further ado, let's go ahead and get right into it. So here is the pie chart for YCS New Jersey's top 32 breakdown, and I gotta say, Trickstar Sky Striker managed to steal the show, and that's really not an understatement because this deck managed to take up 16 of the top 32 slots. That's 50% of the entire representation, and that's really where I want to discuss this deck the most. Now, the reason why Trickstar Sky Striker, in my opinion at least, had such a high representation is for a couple of reasons. A lot of people were experimenting with the Sky Striker build just as a pure build because in the OCG it's having a lot of success, and even leading up to YCS New Jersey, a lot of people noticed that this deck had a lot of really good potential. So Sky Striker was kind of the deck on everyone's radar and what people were really going into the event anticipating. Now, here's where it gets interesting because when you throw Trickstar into the mix, this deck becomes this very interesting hybrid that complements each other very well because when you have these two archetypes, you have an archetype like Trickstar that has very aggressive tools but is very consistent, but then you also have these Sky Striker elements that is just basically one of the strongest toolboxes in terms of a main deck you could ever ask for, and you fuse and meld these two decks together, it almost just creates this very harmonious relationship, and this is what you get. I mean, the interesting thing about this deck is that realistically, the Sky Strikers kind of fix some of the problems that Trickstars have. In the past, we've seen Trickstars having issues with getting over large monsters and just really being able to do something just outside of some of its more basic plays. But the Sky Strikers give it that extra layer of complexity that now it enables the Firewall FTK even more than it did before. You now have the ability to search hard removal like Afterburner or Jamming Wave, and thanks and due to a part with a card like Engage, you also have the ability to boost the consistency of your deck even more than you were able to before. And I think that's the key word here, consistency, because Trickstar on its own was already a very consistent deck. And then when you throw the Sky Strikers into it, while the deck can also kind of rely on Engage and how quickly you get to Engage, even if you don't draw a Sky Striker Engage in this deck, you still have plenty of other consistency to work with to really kind of help get you there while also fueling your deck's other win conditions. Because what you can essentially do is you've got 3 Trickstar Candino, you've got 3 Light Stage, you've got 3 Terraforming, so you're able to pretty much have the consistency of this other engine, and then that also fuels your graveyard with spells because Trickstar Light Stage doesn't happen to be once per turn, and that means you're getting the spells engraved so that when you do get to your Sky Striker cards, you're going to be getting added value off of that without having to play these necessarily dead spell cards that other Sky Striker decks might have to incorporate just so they can fuel their graveyard as quickly as possible to facilitate these cards going off. I mean, you don't have to play stuff like Toon Table of Contents, you don't have to play stuff like Foolish Burial Goods, you're playing cards that just add to the consistency of your deck rather than are cards that are more so just trying to help get cards in the graveyard, and I think that's what's really neat about this deck. This deck has some really cool combos. I mean, you've got stuff like a 2-card Saryuja that you're able to make. I already mentioned the Firewall OTK being even more consistent than it was before, thanks due in part now to a card like Hornet Bit. I am really not surprised to see this deck do as well as it did, but the big reason that I think this deck was very popular was due in part to the new end of match procedures. As I've told you guys before, the new end of match procedures went into effect on June 1st, and this is the first major event where these new rules took place. And not even getting into how just much of a clusterfuck that was, this is probably one of the reasons why players gravitated toward this deck, because you now have a deck that is not only extremely consistent, you can play a ton of hand traps to basically slow your your opponents down because it really doesn't take away from the consistency of your deck. Plus, you have the room because both the Sky Striker and Trickstar engines are just so condensed in the number of cards that they require. But now you have a deck that's not only a tier 1 contender, it has built-in burn damage for when you happen to go into time in some of your games, and that's actually going to help you steal some wins. And from what I've heard, that happened all over the place at this event. Again, we're not going to get too into it, but I think that's one of the reasons why people were very much so gravitated toward this deck, aside from the fact that it seems like a very strong deck as well. So that looks like the deck to beat as we move forward into the format. Now let's touch on some of the other decks. Goki was the next highest represented at 6 slots of the top 32, coming in at about like 19 to 20%, and this really shouldn't be any surprise either. Both Sky Striker, Trickstar, and Goki were looking like very heavy contenders moving into this format, especially here in North America where we have Linkuriboh legal. Goki is going to be much more popular than say in Europe where Linkuriboh is not legal. Now, Goki is still incredibly strong. I mean, the deck is able to completely extra link its opponent and still have plenty of resources. I mean, there's the locks that this deck is able to create with Trigate Wizard, you know, with all the nightmares preventing your board from being targeted, being destroyed. I mean, this is just an incredibly oppressive deck if it goes off, and realistically, if you don't have a hand trap for this deck, you're probably going to lose that game because the deck has multiple extenders. Sky Striker Hornet Bit is an amazing extender for this deck because guess what? The token it generates just happens to be a warrior, so that basically means it synergizes with basically any other warrior monster in the deck to help you get to a Zold. I think that's an incredible piece of synergy there, but I think one of the biggest things holding Goki back as we move into this format is the fact that with decks like Trickstar Sky Striker, as well as pure variants of Sky Striker and Trickstar, of these decks being able to run, you know, 8, 9, 10, 11, even 12 hand traps in the main deck, that's really going to slow the deck down a lot because while the deck is extremely powerful, sometimes it can have some difficulty playing through those hand traps, and if it does get hand trapped, well, you might just be exposed and realistically can just get killed by one of these decks, or allow it to set up to the point where it's not going to matter if you're going to be able to recover at all. So that's really big to note, and just keep that in mind if you're planning on playing Goki moving forward. I'm not taking anything away from the deck and how powerful that it is. There are cards like Called by the Grave, so you can help, you know, kind of mitigate some of these disadvantages, but realistically, this is going to be a very heavy hitter going into the North American WCQ. Now this moves us on to pure Sky Striker, which again, I think a lot of people were expecting this deck to do much better than it did. I know I personally was. I was expecting this deck to take maybe 6, maybe 8 tops at most, because from the results that we've seen so far from the Nationals and the Regionals of the first events of Sky Strikers being legal, Sky Strikers was looking pretty good across the board, and that was giving people a lot of hope, or I guess a lot of worry, depending on how you're looking at it, going into YCS New Jersey. Now, one important thing to note, that even though only 3 Sky Strikers made it into the top 32, all 3 of those Sky Striker players made it to the top 16, as well as the top 8, before they started falling off. So that just goes to show that even though the representation was low in the top 32, it was resilient enough to make it all the way to the top 8 without diluting the number in the top cut. Whereas all the other decks pretty much lost a very heavy number of representation, this deck did not falter. Now, it didn't end up winning the event, but the deck is still incredibly powerful. It's a very good control deck, very similar to Zodiac, as I've mentioned in the past. It plays a lot differently than the Sky Striker Trickstar variant, which has much more aggressive tools. This version, the pure version, is going to play more defensive control elements, where you've got cards like Sky Striker Multi-Roll, which is able to just recover all of your resources, which means you're going to be able to double up on all of your Sky Striker spells, and basically you're just trying to out-resource your opponent, whereas the Trickstar Sky Striker deck can be much more aggressive and use the Trickstar cards to really go in and inflict a lot of damage to your opponent, whereas the pure Sky Striker build doesn't have that asset. So again, there's a varying difference in between these builds, and they both manage to do very well. Just some contrasts in between how you might want to consider running one or the other as we move forward into this season. Now then there were some other decks that managed to take some top slots as well. There was a couple Trickstar decks in there. Really not a surprise. Trickstar's pretty much been the top cut ever since its release, so that's really good. There was a couple Altergeist decks that managed to make the top cut as well. DZev almost managed to make the top 32, but didn't manage to get there on day 2, but I still think that's a pretty good accomplishment overall. Altergeist is one of those decks you really still need to be very careful of, because even though it didn't have the highest representation in the top cut, I still think a lot of players like this deck and what it's able to do. It has a very unique place in this format, and while it may not be the strongest contender, do remember that Hextia Manifestation now have their OCG tech, so that's very important and crucial for a lot of the plays, and I think the deck is still very dangerous, so do keep that in mind in your planning. If you've got any Nationals coming up or anything like that, Altergeist is by no means dead. There's also an ABC player in the top cut. There was a Spiral that made the top cut, which I think is a little surprising that it only managed to have one of the top 32 slots. That deck is still incredibly powerful and very much viable moving into this format, but I think players were, you know, just deciding that Trickstar Sky Striker and Goki were a much better choice. And then there was also a Pendulum player in there as well who managed to make top 32 playing a 60 card Pendulum deck. Shoutouts to Triff Gaming. That guy just managed to just take everyone by surprise and make it to the top cut, so big shoutouts to him. There's also an Elemental Saber deck that managed to go, I believe, 7-2 on day 1, and it didn't manage to make the top 32, but I thought that was worth noting because I think that's pretty impressive, because I know I heavily underestimated that deck, and I think a lot of other people did too, but I thought I'd give credit where credit is due and say, hey man, congrats for making that, because I'd say that's a pretty worthy accomplishment. So the interesting thing here is that the Central American WCQ takes place this weekend at the time of recording this video, and then we have several nationals still that need to take place across Europe. I still think the German national has not taken place, which I know is one of the bigger nationals. And then we have the North and South American WCQ at the end of the month / beginning of July, with the European WCQ following the week after. But realistically, we're not going to have much of an opportunity to really take a glimpse at what other players are thinking about, except from the results of this YCS, because the other events are going to be so much smaller, but I think a lot of players are going to look to this as a guide to really see how the format has shaped up and really take and see what they're going to come up with in terms of if they think Sky Striker Trickstar is the best deck, if they want to play, you know, essentially to build against Sky Striker Trickstar. But it's going to be really interesting to see how the format evolves in these coming weeks before the WCQs, to really see what people come up with and to really test the bounds of creativity, see if there's a essentially diamond in the rough here moving into these WCQs. But guys, those are just my thoughts. Let me know down in the comments what you guys think about this meta analysis, what you think about this format as a whole and how things are shaping up. I'd really love to hear your thoughts. So guys, thank you so much for watching the video. Be sure to like the video as always, subscribe to the channel for more amazing Yu-Gi-Oh content, and if you found this video helpful, consider backing me on Patreon, because just by pledging only $1 a month, you're investing in my ability to continue bringing you amazing Yu-Gi-Oh content. So thanks so much again, and we'll see you next time.